My fiancé joked that he had a backup fiancé in case I ever messed up. I laughed, smart, then walked straight across the room. I handed her the $100 engagement ring and said, "Tag in, buddy. He is all yours." The silence in the room was deafening. My apartment in the Pearl District was supposed to feel intimate and celebratory that night. Instead, under the dim amber lights and the heavy mix of spilled beer and a cologne that was always too strong, it felt like I was standing in a place that barely belonged to me anymore. For 4 years, Zara, a marketing director who thrived on stability, had allowed this space and my life to be defined by the chaotic presence of Carter Hale. His presence, his needs, his friends. They were always the center of the orbit. My living room echoed with laughter that didn't include me, conversations that flowed around me like I was furniture, and a kind of careless joy that only people without consequences can generate. Carter shined at the center of it all. He drifted from one cluster of friends to the next like he owned the air in the room, pouring drinks, smiling, telling jokes that only made sense to him and the people he prioritized. I had learned to live with the fact that Carter was always the main character, and I was fortunate, as I told myself, to be invited into the frame. I used to justify this constant self-erasure by claiming love required compromise. I just never realized the compromise was always, exclusively, mine. As I stood there, attempting to pretend the night felt special, I glanced down at the engagement ring on my hand. It was a thin, hammered silver band holding a cubic zirconia stone. $100 exactly. Carter had called it quirky. And our little inside joke, something we would laugh about later when life was better. I had laughed at the time, too, because the alternative was admitting that the man I planned to marry thought I was worth the least meaningful ring he could find. Still, I held on to the story he told, forcing myself to believe that love should feel thrifty instead of thoughtless. My eyes snagged on Sable Rowe, Carter's college best friend. She somehow appeared at every event of ours, even when she wasn't explicitly invited. The way she adjusted Carter's tie and whispered something against his ear, something that made him smirk, sank into me like a stone. He always insisted they were like siblings, but siblings didn't giggle into each other's necks or send midnight texts with emojis that never belonged in a platonic relationship. For months, I had been gaslighting myself, forcing logic into the uncomfortable gaps of my gut feeling. But that night, the gaps widened into chasms. Suddenly, Sable lifted her hand to fix her hair, and a delicate gold bracelet on her wrist glinted under the lights. My breath hitched. Carter had told me he lost that exact bracelet a year ago. He claimed he couldn't remember where it went and felt terrible about it. But it wasn't lost. It was right there, warm on her skin, fitting her too perfectly to be accidental. It was the first undeniable crack in the version of us I had been clinging to. I told myself the feeling in my stomach was paranoia, nothing more. Yet, something in the air felt profoundly off, humming like the second, right before a chandelier is meant to fall. The truth was already moving toward me, slow and unstoppable. I just hadn't named it yet. The sight of the gold bracelet on Sable's wrist had left a ringing silence in my ears, but I didn't move. I stood there, rooted, trying to decide if I was witnessing a conspiracy or just my own paranoia. I did not realize the night had shifted until Brody Slate, one of Carter's friends, stood on an unsteady chair and raised his glass. The room quieted just enough for his slurred voice to slice through the noise. Carter, looking annoyed, moved toward Brody quickly, almost too quickly, as if he already knew Brody was a grenade with a pin halfway out. But Carter didn't reach him in time. To Carter and Zara, Brody announced, swaying slightly. A couple so solid that not even Carter's backup fiancé could ruin things. The words hung there, absurd and brutal. My chest tightened like someone had taken a fist to it, squeezing until I couldn't breathe. Lauder flickered around the room, confused, awkward, a little too sharp. Then Brody pointed straight at Sable. Right, Sable. You've always been ready to jump in if Zara ever messes up. Silence fell with a sudden, painful thud, and in that silence, I saw Carter look at her. It wasn't a look of horror or denial. It wasn't even embarrassment. It was something dangerously close to acknowledgement, a split-second agreement, a truth they had both lived with while I was left in the dark. That tiny look was the twist that broke the scaffolding I had spent years building around the two of us. Every protective layer inside me collapsed inward. I stood up before I fully knew I was moving. The room blurred as I walked toward Sable, crossing the short distance that felt like a mile. Conversations halted. Glasses paused midair. Every eye in the room was fixed on my back. I didn't allow myself to feel the humiliation. I focused only on the action ahead. My hands did not shake as I opened the little velvet box I had retrieved from the kitchen counter. The ring sat inside, dim under the amber lights, dull in a way that finally, utterly, made sense. Sable, now trapped, simply stared at me, her eyes wide, her face draining of color. I placed the cubic zirconia ring into her trembling hand. My voice was calm and even, lacking any trace of the hysteria I felt boiling inside. "Tag in, buddy," I said, meeting her gaze. "He is all yours?" The reaction was instant and chaotic. Sable's face contorted in shock and a strange mix of fear. Carter stuttered my name, his charm entirely gone, replaced by pure panic. Brody tried to apologize, his voice thick and useless. Everyone else simply stared anywhere but at me, suddenly realizing they were witnesses to a disaster they had all implicitly tolerated. Years of unease suddenly crystallized into a single, profound moment of clarity. I wasn't losing something precious. I was walking away from something that had already been lost, something that was never truly mine. The $100 ring had been an insult I had chosen to call quirky, and now it was a symbolic surrender, but one that gave me back my integrity. I turned back to the room. My voice was quiet, but it was final. "I think everyone should leave now." Carter moved toward me, attempting to reclaim control, calling me dramatic, irrational. But the truth was that I was finally being honest with myself, and for once, he didn't have the power to override me. I repeated the instruction, my eyes steady, focusing on the nearest exit. When the door slammed behind the last, shuffling guest, the silence rushed into the room like cold air. I sat on the couch, surrounded by discarded cups and the fading smell of disappointment. I understood with chilling certainty that the night's humiliation wasn't the real blow. It was only the opening chapter to everything else I was about to uncover, everything I had ignored for far too long. I sat on the couch, numb, surrounded by the remnants of the party, empty glasses, crushed napkins, and the faint, lingering smell of disappointment. The silence should have comforted me, but instead it pressed against my ribs, heavy and expectant. I had just watched the version of my life I tried so hard to believe in collapse. Around 2 in the morning, the pounding started. It was loud, sharp, and angry. Carter's voice cut through the hallway, slurring my name, calling me out for embarrassing him, accusing me of being ungrateful. Brody chimed in too, demanding I apologize as if I had ruined some sacred ritual instead of ending a joke played at my expense. I didn't open the door. Instead, I slipped on my noise, canceling headphones, turned the volume up until the pounding faded into nothing but a distant vibration, and let myself breathe without their voices scraping against my skin. It was the first real boundary I had set with Carter in years, and it felt both terrifying and profoundly necessary. I was choosing my peace over his drama. But even with the music drowning out the chaos outside, certain sounds still slipped through. In a brief pause between songs, I heard Brody spit out something to Carter about not letting Bend come out. Everything inside me froze. Bend. I had carefully tucked away that name in my memory as a harmless guy's trip Carter took 3 months ago. That was the same weekend he had vanished for 12 hours because of a supposed dead phone battery. Suddenly, that single odd detail widened into something much darker. I remembered how he had avoided answering simple questions afterward, how he came home smelling like a cologne he didn't own, and how he showered before even hugging me. I grabbed my phone, removed the headphones, and started scrolling through old photos from that weekend, the ones his friends had posted publicly. That's when I saw her, Sable. She was in Bend at the same time and in the same places the guys were. They had all told me it was a men-only trip. Carter had even laughed at the idea of Sable being there. But there she was, in the background of a bonfire photo, standing far too close to Carter. Her reflection was visible in a window shot, and her hand, holding a beer can, had a distinct nail polish color I knew too well. The air around me tightened. I kept digging and found an old video Brody had once posted, then quickly deleted. Someone had re-uploaded it in a compilation. Carter was laughing loudly at something off screen while a woman's voice chimed in with a playful, "You're terrible." It was Sable's voice. I had heard it enough times over the years to know. My stomach twisted with a sickening certainty. The truth was everywhere, scattered in plain sight, and yet, for years I had convinced myself that Carter's loyalty was unquestionable. He had never been loyal. I just never allowed myself to notice. The pounding eventually faded into silence. Their voices drifted away, but I didn't open the door or take off my headphones. I stayed on the couch with the lights off, staring at the mess around me, feeling only the cold, hard weight of evidence. I knew then that what happened at the engagement party wasn't the start of the conflict. It was merely the moment I finally stopped ignoring the things that had been happening all along, the lies Carter hid behind jokes, charm, and half-truths. And for the first time, I accepted that whatever was coming next wouldn't be simple, and it wouldn't be kind. But at least I knew what I was fighting. The next morning, the exhaustion of the night before gave way to a cold, singular focus. My phone buzzed non-stop with missed calls, voicemails, and messages piling one after another, all from Carter. The tone shifted wildly between anger, guilt, desperation, and then back to blame, the same emotional carousel he always used to pull me back into place. This time, I did not bite. I blocked his number, deleted the threads without reading them, and called a locksmith. Watching the old lock come off my apartment door felt strangely symbolic, like removing the last piece of casual access Carter had to my life, severing the assumption of permanence he had carried. When the locksmith handed me the new keys, I felt something slide back into place inside me, a sturdiness that had been absent for years. Inside the pocket of a shirt, I almost tossed into a donation bag. I found a folded hotel receipt from Seattle. It was dated Valentine's week. A night he had insisted was spent on a work trip, a night I spent alone convincing myself that love sometimes required patience. The sting of it settled deep, but I kept going. The sheer volume of lies was becoming numbing. Then, in the pocket of another shirt, I found a dinner receipt for two from a fancy waterfront restaurant we had never been to together. The note scribbled across the bottom read, "Next time, no interruptions." The handwriting was unmistakably feminine, looping and confident. My shoulders tightened. Suddenly, the stories he told about late meetings and work dinners unraveled like loose threads. Bend was not the only exception. Seattle was not the only exception. The truth was painfully clear. There were probably countless nights I would never know the real story of. The pounding returned just as I finished taping the last box. I opened the door only as far as the chain allowed, enough to see Carter standing there. His eyes were wild, his hair disheveled, demanding to come inside. He called me unreasonable, dramatic, and selfish, raising his voice loud enough that a neighbor cracked her door to look. I stayed calm and told him exactly what the facts were. "Your name is not on the lease, Carter," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the force of law. "You no longer live here." He tried to push the door, but the chain held firm. He told me we needed to talk in private, that I owed him that. My hand didn't even shake when I told him he could schedule a time to pick up his things. Nothing more. He stormed off, shouting that he would return with someone who actually understood what was happening. I knew he meant a lawyer, or perhaps just Sable. A few hours later, I learned who that someone was. My phone buzzed with a message from Sable, sharp and accusatory, insisting I was ruining Carter's life, and that he needed me. Her words confirmed what I had suspected. That alliance between them was not new. It had just finally stepped into the light. As I set the phone down, a cold clarity washed over me. Carter was not retreating. He was preparing to make this ugly, to twist the story until I became the unstable one, the unreasonable one, the villain in the narrative. He needed to protect himself. I stood in the middle of my apartment, now stripped of his presence, and understood that this was not a breakup. This was the opening act of a fight I never asked for, but now had no choice but to confront. By late afternoon, just as I thought the day might finally quiet down, a loud knock rattled my door. When I looked through the peephole, two Portland police officers were standing outside. My stomach dropped immediately. I already knew who sent them before they even spoke. I opened the door, and they informed me that Carter had reported that I changed the locks and illegally removed him from his residence. Hearing those words out loud felt surreal, like he had rewritten our story entirely and expected everyone to believe his version. Without a tremor, I handed over my lease. My name, my signature, my payments, no mention of Carter anywhere. The officers reviewed the document, exchanged a look, and then told me plainly that he had no legal right to enter or live there. They asked if I would allow him to collect his belongings under their supervision. I agreed. I wanted this over with. When Carter walked in behind them, he attempted a dramatic performance, holding his lower back and insisting he needed his ergonomic work chair because it was medically necessary. I didn't say anything. I simply pulled up the receipt on my phone and showed the officers that I had purchased the chair myself months before. They confirmed it belonged to me. Watching him fail to argue his way through that petty moment felt like watching the first brick fall out of a wall he had built with lies. He moved through the apartment gathering his boxes, mumbling insults under his breath. One of the officers warned him to watch his language, especially after he called me something crude under his breath. Down in the parking lot, Sable stood with her arms crossed, pretending to be supportive, but unable to hide how uncomfortable she looked under the scrutiny of the police. Carter tried to project control, but his voice cracked, and every box he carried made the performance harder to maintain. By the time he dragged the last one out, his facade was slipping badly. After he left, I returned to the bedroom to make sure nothing was left behind. Inside a notebook wedged between shelves, I found a faded Polaroid. Carter and Sable were pressed together, smiling in a way that didn't belong to friends. Their clothes and the cabin interior in the background told me everything. The trip, he insisted, was just the guise. The betrayal wasn't a theory anymore. It had been happening long before the engagement party splintered everything. That same evening, the building management called. They had received 2 anonymous complaints claiming loud disturbances and a strong chemical odor coming from my unit. I didn't bother pretending to be confused. I knew exactly what Carter was doing. If he couldn't get back into my home, he would try to push me out of it. I hung up the phone and started documenting everything: dates, times, screenshots, recordings. Something inside me hardened. This was no longer just heartbreak. It was strategy. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It linked to a video floating around a niche social media account where Brody suggested that some women become dangerous when they are dumped. The implication was obvious. They were trying to paint me as unstable before I even had a chance to defend myself. I sat on my couch, lights off, listening to the hum of the refrigerator while the weight of everything settled around me. If I didn't take control now, they would rewrite my entire life into something unrecognizable. I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I needed a professional to fight for my name. The next morning, I met with Evan Mercer, my attorney, in his office overlooking downtown Portland. I knew that after the police visit and the targeted social media smears, I could no longer handle this alone. I told him everything, starting from the engagement party, detailing the door pounding at 2 in the morning, listing the anonymous complaints to management, and explaining the online video smearing my character. Evan listened without interrupting, his composure a welcome contrast to the chaos I had been living through. He calmly jotted notes while I spoke. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said plainly, "This is a coordinated attempt to damage your reputation and destabilize you." Hearing someone else name it, not just betrayal or anger, but a targeted legal pattern, made it real in a way I hadn't let myself acknowledge. I felt relieved that I finally had someone in my corner who understood exactly what was unfolding. Evan immediately drafted a formal cease and desist letter addressed to Carter, Sable, and Brody. It instructed them to stop all forms of harassment and communication. He advised me not to respond to anything they sent, no matter how outrageous, and to preserve every single screenshot and voicemail. He explained how these patterns escalated, how people like Carter relied on chaos to regain control. When I returned home, I immediately put Evan's advice into action. I emailed the building manager, attaching a copy of Evan's letter and detailing the anonymous complaints I had received. I explained how they coincided precisely with Carter's removal from my apartment and my legal defense against his false claims. Sending that email felt like reclaiming the right to defend myself before someone else defined me first. That afternoon, I received another call from management. Someone had submitted a supposed audio recording of me screaming inside my apartment. The file was clumsily edited, choppy enough that even the staff questioned its authenticity, but it was enough to rattle me. The idea that someone was fabricating evidence against me made the walls feel smaller. Even the quiet creaks of the building made me tense. My home didn't feel like a refuge anymore. It felt like a place under surveillance. Later that night, my phone buzzed unexpectedly. It was Mara, a mutual acquaintance from Carter's social circle. Her message was long, apologetic, and filled with things I didn't want to hear but desperately needed to know. She admitted Carter and Sable had been off and on for nearly a year, spending nights together under the guise of work travel. She said she couldn't keep watching Carter blame me in their group chat, portraying me as unstable to cover the truth. Reading her message felt like standing inside a collapsing timeline. Every doubt I had ever pushed aside suddenly lined up in perfect, agonizing order, and just when I thought the day couldn't unravel further, I opened my door to find a plain envelope with my name written in rushed handwriting. Inside were printed screenshots of a conversation between Carter and Sable. In them, Carter outlined a plan to make people think I was mentally unwell, saying it would solve everything if others doubted my stability. My hands shook as I read the lines, each word confirming how far he was willing to go to protect his image. I sat down on the floor with the envelope beside me, letting the weight of it settle. This was no longer about a broken engagement or even simple betrayal. Carter was actively trying to dismantle my credibility piece by piece, hoping I would break before anyone saw who he really was. I understood then that what lay ahead wouldn't be a quiet exit. It would be a full confrontation, one I didn't ask for, but was now forced to prepare for, because protecting myself was no longer optional. It was survival. The morning after I found that envelope detailing Carter's plan to destroy my credibility, I woke with a hollow, yet determined focus. This was no longer about a breakup or even betrayal. It was about reclaiming my sense of safety and my future. I gathered every piece of evidence I had collected: the screenshots, the audio files, the management messages, and the photos, and put them into a single folder before sending them to Evan. He called almost immediately. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of urgency to it. He told me that everything I had sent painted a clear and prosecutable pattern of harassment, defamation, and targeted intimidation. He advised me that the next steps included filing for a protective order and alerting Carter's workplace. Now that we had evidence showing his calculated malice, I handed Evan the footage from the night before, which showed a man in a hoodie approaching my door, slipping the envelope underneath, and leaving quickly. The posture and gait were unmistakable. Evan nodded, saying that combined with the messages, the complaints, and the digital harassment, it was more than enough to support the case we were building. While Evan prepared the official filings, an email from Carter's lawyer arrived. It requested a confidential agreement, a mutual silence about everything that had happened. That alone told me Carter was worried. He wanted the story buried before it surfaced anywhere that mattered. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the power shift back toward me. I declined the offer immediately. I wanted the truth documented, not buried under a non-disclosure agreement. I then met with the building management and presented everything: the video recordings of the man at my door, screenshots of threats, audio files, and the forged reports that had been used against me. They apologized sincerely for the stress the situation had caused and confirmed they would erase all warnings tied to my unit. They also placed Carter on a do not enter list, forbidding him from returning to the property in any capacity. Standing in that office, hearing the word justice applied to my home, I felt something close to relief. Later that week, Avon informed me that Carter's company had initiated an internal review after receiving the harassment documentation. A former colleague of his even contacted me privately, explaining that Carter had carelessly used his work email to communicate with Sable during their secret relationship, a clear violation of company policy. It was a small detail, but it showed how deceit had been woven into the careless fabric of every part of his life. When the day of the court hearing arrived, I wore the simplest outfit I owned. I didn't want anything dramatic. I wanted the facts to speak. Avon presented everything with clarity: every message, every recording, every report, every photo. Carter tried to downplay his behavior, claiming it was just an emotional breakup, but the evidence of a coordinated smear campaign was overwhelming. The judge granted a protective order, requiring him to keep a significant distance from me for an extended period. Hearing that order spoken aloud felt like the first real breath I had taken in weeks. The cycle of manipulation that once targeted me was beginning to close in on him and his allies instead. News reached me through the social circle that Sable had resigned from her job without notice. Carter had completely blamed her for everything falling apart, and she had crumbled under the pressure. I walked home through the Pearl District with a strange lightness in my chest. I closed all the folders on my computer, archived the evidence into a separate drive, and tucked it away. The conflict no longer needed my attention. It no longer owned space in my mind. The cheap engagement ring sat untouched in my drawer. I understood. Then that freedom wasn't walking away from someone. It was walking away from the person I had forced myself to be just to keep their love. I wasn't that woman anymore. The legal fight was done, the protective order secured, and the external conflict was finally silent. When the hearings were done, the emails stopped, and the last trace of Carter's presence disappeared from my apartment. I found myself standing in the middle of the quiet I used to fear. It wasn't the kind of silence that echoed with what-ifs or leftover pain. It was sturdier, like a foundation I had built myself. For the first time in months, my life didn't feel like something I was surviving. It felt like something I was stepping back into, piece by piece, breath by breath. There were still nights when I wondered how I had let things get so far, how I had stayed with someone who chipped away at me one apology, one excuse, one little dismissal at a time. But healing comes with a strange kind of honesty. Some truths hurt, but they free you. The truth was simple. I had been small in my own life for far too long, shrinking myself to fit inside a version of love that was never real. Walking away did not break me. Holding on did. Now, when I pass the window in my living room, I don't flinch at shadows or pause at footsteps in the hall. I cook dinner with music on. I sleep through the night. I breathe without waiting for the next crisis. And sometimes, when the rain hits the glass just right, I recognize the woman looking back at me. Someone steadier, someone older in the ways that matter, someone I didn't realize I was allowed to become. The cheap engagement ring, which I had placed back into the small velvet box after the hearing, sat untouched in my drawer. I took it with me to a local donation center and let it fall into the box with old jewelry and forgotten trinkets. Leaving it behind felt like stepping out of a version of myself that had tolerated far too much. That night, rain streaked down the windows of my apartment. I stood there watching the city blur into soft lights and shadows, realizing the silence did not frighten me anymore. It felt earned. It felt like a beginning, not an ending. I understood then that freedom wasn't walking away from someone, it was walking away from the person I had forced myself to be just to keep their love. I closed the curtains and let the quiet settle inside me, like something finally finding its rightful place. I won't pretend that starting over is easy. It is lonely at times, confusing and humbling, but it is also the first real reminder that life can grow from the places that once felt scorched. The world doesn't end just because someone tried to cage you in their version of it. Sometimes the world begins exactly there, and I finally chose me. The quiet did not feel empty. It felt earned, a reminder that healing isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is just the simple act of closing a door without fear, breathing without trembling, and trusting that the life ahead will be gentler than the one I left behind.